I wanted to just say a few words about how the gallery at Calit2 fits in. You know, Calit2 is in its 10th year, and from the very beginning we wanted to make sure that there would be an environment here that would allow the various disciplines on campus to mingle and explore ways in which these technologies that we develop, for example, touch people's lives, transform communities, and so on. And no better than artists, really, to experimentally go where no one wants to necessarily go. And thanks to the efforts of folks like Ricardo, there's never a dull moment here. And I'm sort of eagerly looking forward to learning more about this installation. I should mention that Calit2 itself, even though we have a large building like the one we are in, is an experiment in itself. It actually is an experiment in trying to stitch something together not only across disciplines but across two campuses. Believe it or not, that is actually quite an unusual undertaking in this 10-campus system to have an institute that not only has a presence here in San Diego but also at Irvine. And both of these campuses have very strong, vigorous visual arts, media arts programs, and they have gone on to become an integral part of what we do here in Calit2. So.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. It is of intense interest to us as artists to be welcomed into this kind of transdisciplinary space that Ramesh and Larry Schmar, in their vision of creating a zone of experimentation, have brought to clear fruition. And certainly the project this evening, the installation that the artists have brought, allow us to at least conceive of the nature of interface, not only as this institution explores it, but as artists explore it. And of course, one of the kind of really lovely architectural structures of this transdisciplinary space is that as you enter Calit2, the first thing you encounter is this kind of aesthetic moment, again, part of the project that Calit2 has established, and I think in a strong manner. So it will be my job to moderate, and it came to me in a moment of email very early, so I wasn't expected to do this, so I didn't take the time to prepare something that a moderator should. So I'll just go straight to the point. This particular project, Overheard, has been something that we've been very excited about to bring in. And the committee worked quite hard to make sure that we were able to have Wendy Richmond here, as well as Michael Chladil, to develop the project. I think my co-chair, Leah, was the one who brought it to us, and we were excited by the textures that Wendy was exploring. And she has, of course, a very rich kind of tradition as a visual artist. She's a writer, educator, whose work explores issues of personal privacy, technology, and creativity in contemporary culture. After graduating from Wesleyan University, Richmond began mixing traditional media with new technology at MIT's Visible Language Workshop/Media Lab, and co-founded Design Lab at WHBH in Boston. She received her master's degree at New York University. Her teaching experience includes MIT, International Center of Photography, Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Wendy is a recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Residency, a National Endowment of the Arts Grant, an LEF Foundation Grant, a Hatch Award for Creative Excellence, and numerous art and design awards. She will, I think, bring to the foreground the connections in terms of her history of art practice and the installation today. She also has a new book, Art Without Compromise. She will be selling it outside. No, I don't know about that. But
it's in the bookstore.
Yeah. Michael Chladil is,
Chladil.
Chladil?
Sorry.
Thank you. Michael Chladil is an interaction designer, prototyping consultant, and multimedia artist who grew up playing with computers, pianos, and small power tools. After graduating from Stevens Institute of Technology, he worked as a software engineer at Crushed-On Electronics. A desire to build physical interactive musical systems led Chladil to earn a master's degree at the Interactive Telecommunications Program, ITP, at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Michael's work at ITP culminated in a modular rope and pulley media control system he invented in order to combine the expressiveness and physicality of human gestures with the power and flexibility of digital media to create new multimedia performances. And I think the installation is at its core that kind of loving moment of physical labor and the sudden, unexpected, overheard texture of unknown connections, almost like spiritual voices. I think at one point we were discussing the kind of ghost in the air. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming. Wendy.
Okay. After that introduction, I feel like, let's just go now. It was so good. Thank you. Well, we thought that what we would do first is just show you a very short clip, so you have some idea of what you're in for very soon. Of course, we hope you're all going to follow us in there pretty soon and spend some time with the exhibit. But over the past week, we've had such an incredible amount of support here. It's just wonderful. And for example, one of the things is that one of the videographers shot some footage, and within hours he'd edit it down to a short 2-minute clip and put it on YouTube. So now it's all over the place, and it's been like that every day. So anyway, we thought, why don't we just start with 2 minutes so you get a sense of what you're going to be seeing, and it'll make some more sense as we have a discussion. So,
shall I go up there and hit it?
Yeah.
Inspired by overheard snippets of cell phone conversations that most people would ignore, artist Wendy Richmond and collaborator Michael Chladil have taken background noise and turned it into interactive artwork.
Well, we've been working on this for a while now. It's really based on ideas of public privacy and about urban density. And the subject of the show is overheard halves of cell phone conversations.
From January 15 through March 12, 2010, in the gallery at Calit2 at UC San Diego, the installation Overheard is on view, consisting of multiple displays of textual graphics based on overheard New York City cell phone conversations, ranging in subject matter from the poetic to the banal. The audio, made up of recordings of conversations spoken by actors, is triggered as the audience moves through the gallery space. In addition, 2 interactive rope and pulley systems allow visitors to interface with the displayed graphics by tugging on ropes to change the graphics' shape and size.
Technology allows us to sort of abstract the conversations out of their original context and to allow the people who come into the gallery exhibition to manipulate them in some way.
I feel that working with technology, you get cramped down. It's so important to involve your body. And when I started working with Michael and seeing his work with the rope and pulley, where he insisted on a physicality, it just was so important to me, and that made me really want to work with him.
The visual elements of the fragmented conversations continue onto the gallery display walls on the first floor of Atkinson Hall. The artists hope that the installation will provide viewers an opportunity to reframe the barrage of private and public expression that they navigate in their everyday lives.
Good summary.
So one of the qualities that I think the nature of the installation is this somatic architecture that allows one to sense the interface, right, in a new way. It's no longer bound to, say, the traditional pad or the mouse or the cell phone structure itself, but again, the muscles, the pulleys, the engines of a kind of an older industry playing itself out. And to what degree, then, was this impulse different in the work that you had done previously to shift it into this kind of embodied format of interactivity? Is this a new element in the way that you have established your other work?
No, actually, part of my background is as a dancer, and I've actually done a lot of collaborations with dancers, one of whom is in the audience right now, Allie Green. Thanks, Michael. All of my work with technology, I've always had the urge to include some physicality with it. But in terms of actually doing exhibitions where it's a combination of technology and physicality, probably this might be the first one. And that really came about because a few years ago, Michael and I started working together. And one of the main things that I think we both felt strongly about, even though we'd never really talked about it when we started working together, was getting out of this and this and this, in this tight little space.
Mm-hmm. I'd elaborate on that a little bit, just in terms of, right, I was directing her to use the microphone, and I won't do it myself now. I was looking for some way to create music in a way that was at both times traditional in character, but also leveraging modern media. But I couldn't quite reconcile this idea of laptop performance with creating music expressively. So the work I've been doing is trying to address that, having a way of performing these technical systems that allow us to call up, as we do in the exhibition, various conversations with a fluidity as if you're playing an instrument, but in a traditional way that feels more personal, that feels more human, rather than a plastic interface.
Also, by the way, you guys are going to be experiencing this rope and pulley as an interactive element of the exhibit, but we also used it when we were developing the work. And a lot of what our work is about is being able to do a lot of different kinds of experimentation really easily. So a lot of Michael's programming is all about setting it up in such a way that it's very easy to say, well, what about this, and what about that, and what if we change this, what if we change that? So process is, to me, probably a lot more important than product. And a lot of what you'll be seeing tonight is about serendipity, about different things happening that you don't expect because of the fluidity of the way Michael wrote the software, because of how we set it up, where you never know what's going to be on one screen that's going to be next to another. Like, for instance, I never noticed this before, but when I just looked up and I was talking, right, in the video, and the little screen next to it said, "She's only 16." I was like, whoa, that was a good little coincidence right there. But that sort of thing has been happening all week, and that's a lot of the point of what you'll see, this coincidence of juxtapositions that you get, for example, when you're in an urban space like New York, which is where all of this took place.
And speaking of urban spaces, a colleague of mine, Benjamin Bratton, is here also. He is a new visual arts faculty. He also has a design, urban theorizing complex upstairs on the second floor, an urban lab, if you will. And I thought it was appropriate that this question of urban density, of kind of the fractals of overheard culture, as kind of the strange, not attractor, but apparatus of relationality that is accidental, that is coincidence, and that allows us, in a certain sense, not to encounter people as subjects, but as I think Virilio called people trajectivities. That is, that people were subjects in movement, in transition, in transmission, so that we are kind of formulated by a multiplex of densities of voices and language and words, which obviously I think you play out. So in terms of this urban density, your sense of the project, Benjamin?
After that, that's a great setup. So my comments really are, I suppose, or my in really questions as well as let's say more what the project is about than in this way, and which seems to me about quite a bit. One of the things that art and design and media art does, particularly here at Calit2 and at UC San Diego, is that it's, as I see it, a way of investigating common problems that we share, but that we don't necessarily haven't developed a common language for, or a commonsensical language for, regardless of the fact that we may be experiencing them. And one of the problems, as I would see it, or one of the conditions that we're living through is if not a disappearance, a fundamental redefinition or shifting of what public space and private space are. Whether or not one is taking over for the other, or one is eating the other, or being eaten by the other, these terms are being changed a lot. So I think it's, first of all, I think it's important then to think about where they came from in the first place. And interestingly, where they come from, without going too deep into it, is you very quickly get into a story about technology and about the ways in which particular types of technologies, printing presses that are replicating a common language, for example, become a key part of how the nation state, for example, as we understand it to be, came into being in constructing a reading public and what historians call an imagined community in relationship to that reading public. So it's not surprising then, as our technologies are transforming so quickly, and transforming so quickly at our interpersonal scale, at an urban scale, and at a continental scale, that the kinds of collective arrangements that we make for ourselves, types of societies and cultures that we enter into, would transform into this as well. Now, one of the major ways in which I see this happening, and I think it goes without saying in a certain extent, is the appearance of electronic spaces, cell phones, of which cell phones are a key interface. If you look at the history of cell phone adoption globally, in terms of other types of technology, television or so forth, the adoption at a global scale of the 6.7 billion people or so in the world, just compared to 15, 20 years ago, is really quite astounding and largely unprecedented. Nokia claims to manufacture, and I have no reason to, 17 phones a second, which I think gives some sense of a scale to the kinds of transformations that are here at working. Now, Ricardo raises the issue of the city, and of course I think this project is a lot about the way in which we live in the city, the way in which we talk to each other, don't talk to each other, the way in which we mediate the city for ourselves. But it's also, I think, raises an interesting question about how it is that, and not just in terms of phones, but how it is we now ask software to do things that we used to ask architecture to do. that we used to ask cities to do. That is, to organize ourselves in spatial configurations, in temporal configurations, in hierarchical configurations. We used to do that with walls and partitions and so forth and so on. And increasingly, that's been subcontracted out to other types of arrangements. I mean, some other types of media, of technology, of software in particular, of which our phones are, of course, one interface to here as well. So, first thing that strikes me about the project then is really this issue of the public and the private, and which is, and I'm raising this really as a way of asking it as a question to the artists about how they must have, it seems to me, think about that. There's any number of different ways we could talk about why we may think that the privatization of institutions, such as universities, such as city streets, so forth, it may be maybe not such a good thing in the long run. But when we try to think about what the opposite of that might be, what the obverse of privatization might be, as a kind of momentum of institutional change, there isn't a common word for this, as I understand. We talk of nationalization. Hugo Chavez nationalizes the oil industry and so forth and so on, but that's not really what we're interested in. I think we need a word, something like publicitization, of making things public, things that used to be private, to somehow make them public again in a new way, making technologies public that were private, making cities that were private more public, making language systems, database systems, any of the institutions that we, for whatever reason, may decide should be more public, that we have that transformation and change available to us in this way. So, with that, just a sort of set of comments. The artist had described the project in terms of a framing and a reframing. That there's a frame by which we see these processes, by which we participate in these processes, by which we encounter these messages, by which we encounter these media, by which they enroll us in their scripts and we enroll them in ours, and that a work like this can potentially destabilize that frame and maybe look at it, maybe ask us to reframe those relationships in a different kind of way. Am I correct then in reading that a lot of what you're asking us to reframe is not only how we encounter words and text and media in the spaces we walk around in, but how our own sense of the privacy of that space and the publicity of the space in which we find ourselves are in a state of flux, in a state of change, and is there a more specific diagnosis or strategy or polemic at work that we may want to take away?
Okay. First of all, I would say, you started out by saying, what is the work about? Just that one phrase I want to address. I think that's the mother of all questions to an artist. What is your work about? And it's one of the most difficult and painful ones. And often I believe that you don't know what your work is about until after you've finished it, probably long after you've finished it, because you're always discovering. And if you know what your work is about before you start it, personally, I think you're doomed. So, having said that, first of all, I think for me, it's about bringing privacy into public spaces and watching it around you and watching it for yourself. For me, every single morning of my life, I spend at least an hour in a cafe. And I'm often really puzzled by why I do this. I live alone, I have a great apartment, and yet every single morning I go out with my laptop. Why? To work? I need to surround myself with this kind of publicness. I go deep into an incredibly private space. And I look up, and after an hour, literally, in this cafe, I look up, and I see other people doing the exact same thing. They are in their private spaces. They might be in their private space of working on a computer, or in their private space of being in a cell phone conversation where in their mind's eye, they're somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And they're not in the cafe. They're not with the other person. They have created a private bubble that is so all-encompassing because of this little piece of technology that it's a mind space. It's some other space. It's partly incredibly rude because I'm sure every single one of you has some example of someone who's really pissed you off because you're standing there and they're announcing their private lives. And then the next day, you hear yourself say the same thing, being just as rude. So now I'm going around and around a bit, but I think for me, what this is so much about is first recognizing it, recognizing that you're hearing this density, and then recognizing that you are doing it too. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this for me started with John Cage. And a quote that I use over and over again, where he says, it's from Credo, where he said, noise is all around us. If you try to ignore it, it's really disturbing. But if you listen to it, it can be fascinating. And that's what started me on listening to these conversations, copying them down for 2 years without any intention, for a year probably. This was not, I didn't do that to create an art piece. And so I'm getting back again to, what is your work about? For me, I start out by observing and wondering and being curious and being affected, and then it turns into art. And I hope it's art now in there. You guys will have to tell us when you go in there that it has become something. I'm still figuring out what it's about, actually.
Well, I was wondering if, counter to the kind of publicity-ness of the kind of density of private-public privatization, all of that Benjamin was bringing out, one of the qualities of the work and the encounter, that this kind of virtual cocoon that I think Virilio mentioned was a disease, is really about creating, at least in this work, a poetic encounter. That is, that the language of the overheard, the text in your email, all become kind of a Joycean moment, Finnegan's Wake, that allows us then to participate in a different sort of public quality. I often like to look at etymologies of words, and public is from pubis. That is that most sensitive of secret places becoming part of the general condition. And certainly the poetic, the overheard is part of that pubis, right? That secret spot, that dark continent of language that allows us perhaps to find things disturbing or find things beautiful, but at the same time we only know what it ultimately functioned as afterward, after we hung up, after we leave that space. And I do think that as an artist that often it's navigating the encounter and the afterwards.
Right.
But I was wondering, Michael, in terms of Benjamin's definition of software as kind of a determining modality of the new publicness or privateness, which I think is part and parcel of everything that's around us. And certainly your gesture of pulling data. I just saw like at the Las Vegas show where they have the new hands kind of Wii, right, where Microsoft allows you to manipulate your data like a minority report, right? So to what degree do you see software as an architecture in your aesthetic?
I haven't really considered it in that way before, but as he was speaking, I sort of found it interesting that software in this way gives us a kind of transparency. And the first things that came to mind were the open source movement, this idea that people want to make free, make available the ability to look at what the software does in such a way as to add a layer of transparency onto things. And I think that's sort of an architecture that we're presenting now, that people are very interested in having software that behaves in that way, in knowing not only what data is available, these vast data sets and everything, but also knowing what the underlying software does in those cases, that you could read the source code.
And repurpose it.
And so software is inherently malleable in that regard. And I think in a lot of what we've done in this show as well, and sort of as the week went on, we tried our best to make it as to lock it down as much as possible, then just for the sake of reliability. But software being malleable, it's to take your idea of architecture and software. People want to be able to repurpose all of this stuff. They want to be able to remix it, reuse it, and turn it into other things.
And one of the things that I think is an interesting tension, say, between the notion of transparency, access to data, kind of a Brechtian moment of seeing the modes of production and having access to them, is the opacity of the overheard. That is, one doesn't understand the data sets of what is being overheard. One doesn't understand the narrative. One just says, here's, I'm going to kill you. Bye, love you, right? All in the same data set. So I think that is kind of a nice frisson between the transparent and the opaque, right? And we often have to navigate those spaces. And I think the penultimate dream would be to have that transparent data set become the site of a creative opacity, and in its process. At least that's when I drink a lot. That tends to be what I imagine.
Wait. Creative opacity? Say more.
Well, that is that the data set, the densities of kind of the process that Michael is speaking about, is that open source, the code itself is malleable because it's transparent. One can see its functions, and I think that's a very kind of exciting moment. But in the poetic, it is that overheard, that element which isn't necessarily transparent, isn't necessarily malleable in kind of a direct way. And so to have a creative opacity in the densities of transparency, I think would be interesting to illuminate. And I think your work in a certain encounter that.
I just have to say that I really like this, and I have to use this. Maybe the title of my next column, Creative Opacity. I like this because
I stole it from my neighbor.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
I've got to credit somebody else. Okay, I'll email you. But one of the things about overhearing these conversations is that you only overhear you hear half of it, right? And so you wonder what was on the other half, and that other half is opaque. It's opaque, but at the same time, you cannot help but imagine what it was from your own experience. So you hear, Dad, I know, no, Dad, yeah, I'll be really unhappy if I don't get an A. Dad, no, I do have a game plan. I'm just tired. I can't talk now. And, what did you just fill in? All that blank part that I didn't tell you, you filled it in. And it's opaque, and yet if we're quoting people, Roland Barthes, my other favorite, it says the meaning does not come from the author. The meaning does not come from the artist. It comes from the viewer, or it comes from the reader. And the meaning doesn't exist until it's read or until it's seen. And that's a lot about this exhibit, I think, is the meaning comes from the blanks. The meaning comes from the opaque part that you don't hear or that you don't see. Who said that phrase? Who was that? That's what you fill in. And for me, the audience is so much more important than we are. What I often say in my teaching is, I hope by the end of this course, I'm the least important person in this room. Because where does it really have to come from? You know.
Well, speaking of reception, we have a crew out here of audience, readers, responders, and so if it's all right with all of you, if I can bring them into the conversation.
Could I just
certainly.
one so that I am on the open source thing. It's interesting. Then I think that perhaps that there are models for understanding the institutionality of software in this way that we borrow from cities and architectures, metaphors, and other sorts of things as well. So maybe one of the things that needs to be thought about is how it is that the strategy of the remix and the reuse and the repurposing and of this as a kind of an infrastructure that we share might be applied to the city. What are our open source cities and how this might work like? Because it seems to me that there's an interesting thing at work here, where on the one end, a project like this may point to a kind of end of privacy, a kind of way in which the spaces in which we work, our expectations of privacy are less than they used to be, or they're transforming quite a bit. And at the same time that there's an end of publicity, if you like, within the physical spaces of the city. That street sidewalks become malls, and so forth and so on, where that one in fact may replace the other or eat the other in that sort of way. Anyway, other things to say, but I'll leave it. I'd be much more interested to hear what everyone else has to say.
So one of the, I think, again, that sort of what eats what is that the telephone, the cell phone demand response. Like Pavlov's bell sometime, right? You must answer the call or not answer the call. We spoke briefly about Alexander Graham Bell. Why was he answering the call, right? Wanting to speak to the dead was his basic impulse, right? His deaf mother. So often the demand of communication we often take to be of kind of rational spaces, transparent spaces, but they might be the call or demand of something other than what is expected through the process of the technology. But any kind of thoughts or questions? I know a lot of you haven't been able to go through the installation yet, but we hope. But just, yes.
I wanted to say, when you make things public around me, you take away my privacy. And that bothers me, because if I'm on, like I was telling him ahead of time, I'm on public transit, so when that person next to me is talking about whatever is going on, I might be in my own thoughts, and now I'm not in my own thoughts because you've taken away my privacy. That just bothers me sometimes, that what it is a loss of privacy. And do I have to adapt to that? I guess I have to, but that doesn't mean I go down happy. And the other thing is, when you take your laptop to some place for an hour, a lot of people turn the television on just for the noise. You want to be private, yet you want to be around a social group.
Yeah.
Even if you don't want to interact with them, you need that space. And I think electronics takes us sometimes away from people. And this is our way of getting back to people in some respect.
So there's so many ironies.
Anybody want to answer the call? Yes.
Which conversations did you find most interesting to manipulate and to play with? The ones that were more the norm, or the ones that were more on the offensive side? Or I know there aren't too many in the installation, but as you went through and as you weeded through them, why did you select the ones that you chose?
Why don't you start with that?
it's interesting because we got it down to about 20 conversations out of many, many, many. And during the process, we invited a bunch of friends over to just kind of do what I called a prototype party, as you remember. And some of the people wanted more dramatic conversations, you know, more somebody beating up his girlfriend or something, you know, whatever, that one you heard.
Something more dramatic. Or
More
something,
dramatic.
You know?
And what I wanted the mundane, you know, I wanted this stuff where you'd hear yourself say it the next day, you know, the stuff that you hear over and over again. So, and we're not manipulating, I mean, they're all pretty close to verbatim, you know, so we're not manipulating them, but the juxtapositions are turning out to be sort of funny and endless. I don't know, you guys will see when you go in just what. There's, by the way, there's text, projected text, a lot of projected text. Then there's text that you can manipulate. I keep going like this, you'll see, manipulate. And then there's audio. And so you'll also hear these halves of conversations. So it's a combination of all that's layered. So we'll see what.
In some way, it's an attempt to recreate an environment, but in a not in its exact, not exactly recreate the environment, but to give you the elements and the taste of the elements of that environment, so that you can do what Wendy was talking about to respond to it, to give you the raw materials
Right.
to remember, and then to respond with your memories,
Right.
and to fill in the other halves of the
Right.
conversations, and perhaps later on, this week, next month, or something, you hear something, and then there's that in the back of your mind, the experience that you had of manipulating them this way, and perhaps you do that again.
There was another question. Yes.
Mhm.
So did you try to have the actors keep the same inflection you heard, or were you directing them in the tone and the way in which they're imparting their words, because that's been you framing it?
Yeah.
And my second question I would like to ask is, I'm curious, because what was it like for two artists to collaborate and the process of collaboration?
Okay, I'll take the first part. So Michael, think about the second part, okay? Well, first of all, when I was looking for actors to read it, I really didn't want to tell them who it was that I overheard, male, female, young, old, what, you know, race, religion, because I was really curious to see how they interpreted it. And as a matter of fact, I had a few different actors do a few different voices, so you'll hear a male voice doing the same thing as a female voice, and so on. And then, you know, the fact that they're actors, there's a question there, because we're purposely, I mean, on one hand, as Michael was saying, we're sort of recreating a situation, but on the other, I wanted to create a kind of lack of reality, so that you will distance yourself enough so you know it is acted. I mean, this is not real. Yes, they're real conversations, but we are in an art gallery. This is not real. Pull yourself out, step back from it, reframe it.
So, in terms of the collaboration, what can you?
I'm just curious, what brought you together, and how was the process?
Sure. So, how did it happen originally? I was working on my master's degree at NYU, and I was looking for excellent.
Yes. Thank you. Finally. Please take that call.
I was looking for a way to improve my creative process. I'm a particularly technically minded person, and with an artistic leaning, and I wanted some way of being able to develop with confidence artistic work. And Wendy was slated to teach a course at NYU, and by chance and the circumstance that she wasn't able to do that, but I sought her out for an internship, and so we began working at that time together. And one of the first things we did together was sort of an introduction for me for a way of beginning a creative process, which is looking at the stuff that you've done before. And if you read her book, you'll see you'll read a lot about this creative process loop that she sets forth in there. And so one of our first exercises together was really to go through the body of work that she had developed, because she was in the stages of developing new work. This was just after her previous exhibition, Public Privacy. And so I built some software that would allow her to look at these different videos and then juxtapose them against different sounds, basically for the idea of creating chance connections. What's interesting? Oh, what sparks us as something that might be the germ of an idea to begin with. So that's how the collaboration began. And simultaneously, I was developing this interface that eventually turned into the rope and pulley. And so we sort of went back and forth along these two trajectories that both of us were engaged in, and they sort of weaved their way in and out as we went along. And so when the opportunity for this exhibition when Wendy was contacted about doing an exhibition here, it sort of, in some ways, became a teachable moment, if you will, for me to engage in an artistic, a full-on artistic project. And so in the collaboration, Wendy has the conceptual idea for the exhibition, and as you'll read in the interview that's available in the gallery space, I sort of consider myself to be more of a tool maker. It's actually something that's in my family history. That's kind of the stock that I come from, so it makes sense to me in that way. But I build software tools that allow us to experiment and try and develop my proficiency at building things quickly and experimenting. So, it was good.
I think it's been interesting because gallery at Calit2, it's maybe Trish, the keeper of the archive, but we're about a season and a half into our project of gallery at Calit2. But I would say that the predominant gestures in all the work have always been, and I don't particularly like this word, a triangulation between the materiality of language, sonification, and software. And often the kind of template of encounter has been the screenal in one way or another. So I think that's an interesting matrix in terms of new media as kind of core components, at least the way they've played themselves out here. So just a generality about the shows that we've had. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, this is very interesting. As you were talking, it struck me that there are profound cultural differences around the world in how societies, cultural groups, or class groups define the boundaries between the private and the public. I think, for example, in Muslim societies, there's a tendency for the boundary between the private space of the home and the public space anywhere out in the public to be sharper than maybe it is in the United States or in Europe. But what you said made me realize that we wouldn't want to stereotype that, because these boundaries are, I can see, extremely fluid now everywhere in the world, owing to this technology and this communication that we have in the late 20th century now. So that change going on in this distinction. The example that I keep thinking of is the public space where there's an audience in a public space, and I'm thinking particularly movie theaters, where it seemed to me that people didn't talk in the movies 20 years ago like they do now. And when I go to a movie, I want everybody to shut up right away. I want them to, even during the Stella Artois ad, I want them to shut up and not say anything. But I've taken a very absolutist view about this, that people should not talk in movies, but it suddenly is striking me by what you said, that there may be a changing definition of public space, that a lot of other people may think that it's perfectly normal to talk to your friend in a movie theater because of, I don't know what, may have the impact of the cell phone or Facebook, I don't know what it is. But it's not just me, you know, it's a changing definition, and I want the movie theater to turn into a private space.
Right.
And like the woman in front of me was saying, but there's this tension that goes on between the public and the private, and the same thing happens in the cafe, doesn't it? Where you want to be buried in your laptop, and yet you overhear in a way you want to overhear, and I think this happens in so many spheres, and it must be happening around the world and changing everybody's sense of public and private.
Just quick, I appreciate the comment. I think you're right in many respects. I think that what we're seeing perhaps is that in any given location or for any of us, that we're asked to negotiate. I mean, if there's a particular way in which we might differentiate the public and the private, one sort of overlapping each other or inside each other, we could call that maybe one, I don't know, a regime, just sort of word, right? And that there are, at any particular point in time, and I think arguably any point in time, more than one regime at work at once, right? And that we may all be, in essence, negotiating several different ones. And I think that that are cultural, that are religious, that are traditional, that are political, that are architectural, that are linguistic, that are phenomenological, and so forth, and that these sorts of technologies not only represent another regime, but probably several in and of themselves that complicate these issues in different sorts of ways. But I think Wendy's point about the bubble is probably is right in this regard, that it's a way in which whereas the private may have been, and this is, I think, goes back to what I was saying about we're asking software to do things we used to ask architecture to do, whereas the private may have been a house with a street and around with this, and that in this, between these walls, I have my privacy. Now those walls are something you can bring with you in a way, or you think you're bringing them with you in a way or another, or you behave as though you were bringing them with you in that sort of way as well. A similar experience, I was just, while you were speaking, I was apropos of nothing, but during a research trip to Indonesia, I have a similar experience with the movie theater as you. I was quite taken by the boisterousness of the whole thing, and there was, they were barbecuing lambs inside the movie theater. So unright, and kids playing and all sorts of stuff like this, talking about this thing, and ever since then, it doesn't bother me. It was, it was just really, I got it. Yeah.
On that note.
Yeah. Well, yes. One last question.
It's more of a comment. It's interesting. Part of why we go to, I think, to see movies in movie theaters is precisely because of the social contagion that's happening there. That somebody else is laughing next to me. The movie's 10 times funnier. The person next to me is jumping every time the scary monster comes on the screen. It's that much more frightening. So even though I'm going there as an individual and maybe just by myself to see it or with one other person, I'm really going for that public experience, even though I'm embracing it as an individual. I think one of the consequences, though, of hearing these bits and pieces of fragments is that those are also contagious, and probably also having an effect on how we're feeling, thinking, everything else in maybe the same kind of subtle ways that the person next to you laughing during the wrong scene of a movie or during the right scene of a movie is as well. So I'm curious about that aspect of it, not just the words that we're hearing, but also the affects and ways that those affects.
I think there is this sense of we've gone from virtual cocooning to kind of sticky bubbling. And that sticky bubbling is this kind of affective connectivity, which we do seek isolation and communal affect that creates, intensities or processes. But there are these occasions where they break down and something else happens. And certainly we want that in art. We want that at, rituals of games or funerals or what have you. I was going to say my experiences of the early days of theater were in Las Vegas at grind houses, right? Or we used to call them vomit houses. And you just go there and you watch endless double features of truly horrible films. And you just hang out with your friends, drinking, smoking, yelling at the horrible movie. And that was the joy of it, right? Later on, like Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of brought that up. And so I think one of the powers perhaps of these densities, of these spaces is, again, how can we create these kind of not utilitarian fog, but these kind of sticky clouds of that allow some sensibility of connectivity that is perhaps just overheard and partially felt, but elucidates another sort of collectivity, which yet, as I think others had said, doesn't necessarily have a name as yet, or perhaps we have overnamed it. Okay, so go enjoy, have some drinks. Thank you so very much to the panel and the artists.